All right, welcome everybody to the Playing Games podcast. And today we have a very special episode because we have a very special guest, Dr. Gerard McMahon. Dr. McMahon, how are you doing today?
I'm all good. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for your time and allowing us to have you on for today. And today we will actually be going over a lot of this social media science that has been going around and hopefully to debunk some of it or elaborate on how complex it could really get. But before we get into all of that, Dr. McMahon, would you mind telling the viewers a little bit about your background and experience as an exercise scientist so they can get to know you a little bit better and where you come from in the field?
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergrad degree in sport and exercise sciences, bachelor's honours degree at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, Belfast. I then did a master's in sports physiology in Liverpool, John Moores, and then I did my PhD on the physiological and biomechanical basis of muscle hypertrophy and atrophy in Manchester Metropolitan University. So that is essentially where lengthened partials come from, was my PhD. Um, that's where they originated in literature. You'll see my papers were the very first ones done on them. So that was a topic of my PhD, but I did a lot of other general work around muscle, tendon, neural activation and stuff like that. And I suppose that's essentially the main focus of my research area. Did just some biochemical analysis to go along with that, some growth factor analysis. But yeah, mostly what I work on is kind of neuromuscle, tendon mechanics, physiology, and how that, in the most part, relates to muscle hypertrophy. But also I dabble in a bit of sports performance as well. So I've been a sports scientist, stroke strength and conditioning coach with elite professional athletes, Olympic athletes for the best part of 20 years now as well. So a really good aspect of what I do has always been twinning that with the actual real life applied work where I get to do some pretty neat testing of really elite athletes and stuff and their responses to the programs. And I get to check some of this muscle mechanics stuff, for myself. And populations, it's not just argument on theory all the time. So I do have the tools to actually test this on actual athletes as well. So yeah, it's been a really nice career. I've thoroughly enjoyed it so far. So yeah.
And that's awesome. I think having that practical experience matters, maybe just as much as having that, those theories around what goes on in the lab and see how that applies practically to people who, really do this for a living with their insane bodies. And
Yeah. It
so,
makes a huge. I can't well undersell how big an impact it makes for your understanding because on both sides really, because people have a lot of theories about how people respond and they get into really nitpicking on different theories and stuff like that there. But when you get a flavor of the responsiveness because you're constantly watching people train and you do have the tools to measure it, like we don't publish everything we measure. And that's the other thing is when you've access to imaging, you've access to EMG and stuff, and you're constantly doing this, you build up an even broader knowledge because when you do say training studies as an academic, they take they can take years to do. You do the training study, but by the time the research gets out, it's an extended period of time. But in the real world, you can do a lot of things a lot quicker. But we don't always publish all that. So actually, when you do straddle both worlds between theory and applied practice, you get an actually even better sense of what works and what doesn't work as well.
and I mean, at the end of the day, all the gym goers and guys who are interested in building muscle or these science based lifters, they just want to apply these studies into their actual training. Either that or it's mostly marketing. But
Yes, I think they're very overzealous and confident about what they think happens and what goes on. And again, they would appreciate nuance a lot better if they actually measured what they're saying happens and doesn't happen. You get a real sense, like I said before, you get a real sense of what works and what doesn't work, what has practically meaningful adaptation, and what may look great and sound great in theory actually just makes no difference at all.
Absolutely. And one of this popular understanding is this concept of tension, where many people try to get this physics understanding and they directly try to apply it to muscle, but then they get confused and they start using these properties that muscles have, and then they try to combine them together, and then this is what created, and this is what we're going to get into first, um, what is known as the most important driver of hypertrophy, which is mechanical tension, or tension in the context of mechanical to begin with. That said, this understanding of tension is that, let's say you do a bicep curl for, let's go for 8 reps. The first few, maybe 3, 4 reps, are relatively equal in velocity or in speed. I'm just throwing numbers out there. Now, as we get closer to this failure point, or this point where we can no longer complete the curl because either our muscles are too tired or this perception of effort is too high, our speed slows down, the velocity decreases. And so what people have been saying is that, well, this concept of tension exists on this curve, what's known as the force velocity curve, that in the concentric, where is the lifting phase of the bicep curl, as it unintentionally slows down, keyword unintentionally, we don't want to intentionally slow down, that indicates that force, or the force that our muscles are generating, is increasing. So the slower our speed is on the concentric, the higher our muscle fibers are, the higher force our muscle fibers are producing. And so I'm very interested to know if that is really how that works, or if you have some comments on that, and maybe we have a misunderstanding of how we're applying tension into muscle.
Yeah, so the external physics of it doesn't change. You know, the bicep still requires X amount of energy to move it through gravity. You know, none of that actual changes, but you do have the potential for the internal environment to change. Now, this is where I think a lot of the misunderstanding starts beginning, because the force velocity curve, like you mentioned before, you know, starts off isometric, this portion of the curve, if we ignore the eccentric part, isometric, very high, moving down, very steep curve. Originally, force drops off relatively quickly and curves out and towards maximal shortening velocities. So what people understand will think was, okay, we were originally, say this is the isometric part, we were originally sort of here, and now we're shifting back towards the isometric part and where the higher force will be. But that's viewing the force velocity relationship under fresh conditions. Okay, so what happens to the actual force velocity relationship as we fatigue is it is downward shifted, directly downward shifted. So now what you have is the isometric part still, you know, it's a similar, I'll say the actual shape of the curve changes as well. Similar sort of shape where the isometric is, but the fact that it's shifted downward is the points where you were actually generating force in a fresh state, even though the curve, or sorry, even though you've moved back towards a slower shortened velocity, the actual force, because of the downward shift, is lower. Okay, so that's very, very clear. You know, it doesn't matter that you're actually slowing down is the fact that fatigue is now the main factor. Is the shape is slightly changed, but that's actually more towards the maximal velocity end of things. The actual force that you produce, even at a slower speed, is less because of the physiological effect of fatigue on our force generating capacity. So I'll maybe elaborate a wee bit more on the factors involved on why we're not actually producing more force because we're going slower. Now, at the minute, the best explanation we have for the velocity component being reduced and shifted differentially under fatigue versus fresh state is more than likely to do with ADP accumulation is in the cell, is the proposed to be the main culprit. There's other potential ones as well, pH and stuff, the usual sort of ionic imbalances and stuff like that you get with muscle fatigue. But at the minute, ADP seems to be the main character. So essentially what it's doing is reducing the rate of cross-bridge attachments and reattachments. Attachments and detachments. So that obviously is going to affect force in magnitude, but also the rate. If its rate's been affected, then it's going to be slower. Okay, so that's why you're actually slowing down, is ADP accumulating within the muscle cell. The second part of it then, and why you're not actually producing more force, is, and again, well, people get sort of mixed up in the neurophysiology of this and don't really grasp the actual nuance of it. So people will say, oh, you'll get increased neural, they'll say activation, but in terms of activation, say how many reps did you say? 8 to 10 reps or something like that. So at those sorts of loads, motor unit recruitment's pretty much max in a lot of muscles. So you're probably going to get them just increasing their firing rate in response to trying to increase more force. So what firing rate does to increase force is it essentially prolongs the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and allows that the contractile components to bathe in the calcium and let cross-bridge cycling continue. So that's the effect of largely of an increased firing rate. But even though under fatigue you're starting to see increased firing rates in some of the higher threshold motor units, Duchateau showed absolutely beautifully that under higher load reps on fatigue, that there was no issue at all in recruiting motor units at all. There was no actual decrease in central drive. The entire crux of the fatigue at the muscle was actually completely peripheral in nature. And what he actually showed was that it was excitation, contraction, coupling failure that was driving the drop in force. So you can get the motor unit to produce more action potentials and have an increased motor unit firing rate, but those firing rates, that's not effectively reaching the muscle cell to release calcium, because there's a number of different excitation, contraction, coupling mechanisms, but one of the main ones is there seems to be probably a decreased sensitivity to that calcium release, probably being the main one. So the fact that yes, you can measure an increased firing rate from maybe a type 2 motor unit, because you say, oh, type 2X motor units as well, higher threshold ones are going to be the ones that are preferentially growing. This looks pretty good to me. It actually is fairly meaningless, because the actual action potential's effect of releasing calcium isn't actually leading to any more force being produced at all. And that's what we see. We just, despite this increase in firing rate, we still see the force going down. So yeah, there's a complete misunderstanding, unfortunately, of neuromuscle physiology there, and the disconnect between the force velocity relationship and sort of neuromuscular fatigue, and the nature of that neuromuscular fatigue as well, and what going towards complete failure actually entails.
So I think what some may be thinking right now then is that, from what I was able to understand, from the beginning of the rep, the tension stays constant, right? There's no need for it to increase or anything, at least externally, right? So
Yep.
tension is constant. So as we get closer to failure, what our body does is it tries to maintain that tension level, right? It doesn't necessarily try to increase it, correct?
Well, again, the neural strategy depends on the intensity of the contraction, because with light loads, we will get increase in motor unit recruitment of the higher threshold motor units eventually over time and as we progress. But if it's higher intensity, um, lifts that we're doing, you've passed what we call the upper recruitment threshold. So once you've passed the upper recruitment threshold, there's no more motor units to be recruited, and they're all that. And people don't seem to understand this, that the upper recruitment threshold is probably, it can be surprisingly low. It depends on the muscle type. Lots of different muscles have different upper recruitment thresholds. Small muscles, for example, in the hands, you recruit all your motor units at 40-50% MVC. Now, the larger muscles have upper recruitment thresholds that are higher. Most, virtually all of them, will have maximum motor units recruited at around 80 to 85% MVC, and there's a couple higher up towards 90. The biceps are one of the highest ones at 88% MVC. But once you're exercising at a certain intensity, you've no more motor units to recruit. As the reps progress, it's only firing rates that'll increase, and that's been shown, I don't know how many times over the last 60 years or so. That's a fairly standard neuromuscular strategy.
And as you said, but these increases in firing rates, they don't necessarily reach the fiber, so they don't really contribute to more fiber force, correct?
They do originally, but then as you continue to go through the process of fatigue and failure, that's when it stops, and particularly the calcium sensitivity drops off, and then that's where I mean the excitation contraction coupling failure mechanisms really kick in at that stage. And so the force, obviously, that's being generated by cross bridges, that's just not happening anymore as well. And that's what I mean, is when people can read papers, but they don't do the experiments for themselves. And you can see this happening in the lab. You can see force continually going down. You should experience it during a rep yourself. You can try your hardest, but the velocity is going nowhere, the force is going nowhere. And in fact, even if you're isometrically holding it there, eventually you'll just start lowering it, and that's just because the contractile mechanisms are just failing one by one.
So, I mean, this has people then probably going to say that, well, if we already recruit all our motor units or muscle fibers, at least the important ones, that we want to recruit, kind of far from failure, let's say 5 reps from failure, 6, 7, maybe 8, then is there no need to train to failure? Or is there a reason why we do want to get a little close to that failure point? Maybe there's a sufficient amount of time that we want to generate those forces at?
Yeah, again, depending on load, if you've surpassed the recruitment threshold, that you have all your, like, all your motor units are completely recruited, and most people go to failure for that reason, is because they still believe that they're recruiting more motor units. Okay, so once you've got them all on board, the only thing you can do is lose them from that point. Okay, now usually some of the lower threshold ones can drop out as well, but in terms of going really close to failure, I am not convinced at all beyond 2 to 3 reps in reserve holds any benefit. And if you look at the studies, whether they be velocity decrement studies or some of the reps in reserve studies, the vast majority of them show that with a few reps in reserve, and the two meta-analysis that have already been done on this have already shown that there's no actual value for hypertrophy going completely to failure versus at least around two reps in reserve. But I've seen a lot of kickback on social media. These people outraged that some of these studies are showing 3, 4, 5 reps in reserve are actually still show the exact same benefit as complete failure, and that's because they don't understand about upper recruitment thresholds, and that's because they in their head always think going to failure is the only way that you will recruit more motor units, when that's absolutely not the case. So yeah, and even in the velocity decrement studies, sometimes you've 20, 40, 60% decrement. The 60% decrement, which is the highest, obviously, velocity loss, shows in terms slightly lower muscle growth. So it's at least comparable anyway, but potentially even lower. But in the most time, they're pretty much similar. So I don't see any value really on going 2 to 3 reps in reserve. And again, I've had the fortune to be able to measure this in athletes, and I never have seen the going to complete failure ever produce superior results.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to reach that point where we think we recruited all motor units and stop, right? Because let's say we do a 5 rep max, and that first rep of the 5 rep max, all our motor units are recruited. That's just one rep. Okay, we recruited our motor units. Let's stop, because anything further from there we might fatigue. There should be some amount of time interval that we'd want to generate that force, right? Because I think in the literature, like a 1 rep max doesn't really build a lot of muscle as much
Well,
as maintaining that force for a certain amount of reps.
well, yeah, it's not maybe the time, but volume. Total volume of exposure to that mechanical load. So for me, the reason why 1RMs don't build muscle particularly well, if you think about it, is you have to have more maximal motor unit recruitment, and the other probably 15 to 20% of that maximum effort is made up of maximal rate coding or firing rate. That takes time to recover. So you can never get particularly high volume when you're constantly trying to do 1RMs, because it takes several minutes to recover sufficiently neuromuscularly to provide that high an effort again. So the volume of work that you do with all your motor units recruited is significantly less with really high training. So that's the other thing that I twin this with is, once you've got all your motor units on board, and probably failure the last 2 reps aren't really worth much, is how can I maximize the total volume where everything's on board and being working really well and getting all the tension to the muscle that I need it to. So, and then that ties in yet again with rest intervals. So there's what I call a 4-pillar approach to maximizing that sort of mechanical tension. So assuming the mechanics of your exercise is pretty sound, is you have your load or intensity, the amount of reps you're doing, the proximity to failure, and the rest interval. Okay, so if the slightly further I stay from failure, and I've got all those motor units on board because of the velocity, and I can do, remember, or sorry, not because of velocity, because of the intensity. Now remember, as soon as you've got that intensity from that recruitment threshold, there's only a certain amount of reps you can do. That's already dictated, within X amount of reps, the most you can do. So say the upper recruitment threshold is 80% of your 1RM, that probably limits you somewhere between 8 to 12 reps. Okay, so that's how the recruitment threshold also sorts out the amount of reps you should actually be doing. And that ties in with the theoretical mathematical modeling of motor unit behavior as well, is once it goes to 80%, you've probably got about 14 to 15, 16 seconds worth before you'll start seeing potential decrements. So that dictates your amount of reps. So you've got your upper recruitment threshold dictated by the intensity. You've got the reps, which that upper recruitment threshold dictates the approximate amount and number of. You've got your proximity to failure. If I don't go completely to failure, I just don't need quite as much rest interval to be right again. But if I go to failure, I don't know, bar accumulating fatigue in an acute sense, I don't think going to failure is catastrophic in any way either. I just don't think it's the best use of your resources, because if you go to failure, that now means you need to rest longer to reset the sarcolemmal excitability and all the fatigue mechanisms, the excitation, contraction, coupling fatigue mechanisms. You need to give them time. A lot of those are active ATP consuming, so you need to give them time, which also ties into metabolism as well. So you need to get them time to reset so that your muscle then can go through its kind of more optimal volume of work with all of its motor units on board. Do you see how all those four factors all interchangeably affect each other?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of this confusion comes with the model of the five stimulating reps model, or the stimulating reps model. I've heard many versions of this model. Sometimes, I don't know, they change it to like, oh, it's not, because I don't want to say originally, but a popular one that has been going around is that the last 5 reps to failure are the ones that matter, and the ones before that aren't really that stimulating, right? It's those last 5 reps. Now, there are other versions of this model where saying, well, not really. It's just it's kind of just like a point of that we want to reach within those 5 reps, or it's just like a range. But social media has the concept of it being exactly 5, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's those last 5 reps. Now, many understand that effort, or perception of effort, is closely related to motor unit recruitment. So as we get closer to these reps, closer or to failure, there's higher effort or perception of effort, and then therefore there must be greater increases in motor unit recruitment. So therefore, maybe there could be some confusion saying that just because there's higher effort doesn't necessarily mean that we're recruiting more motor units. It could just mean that we're just fatiguing ourselves because the motor units were already recruited probably beforehand. Like you mentioned, they could be recruited earlier in some muscles. And so with this model, people now kind of say, well, training near failure is important to recruit those motor units. Be like, okay, well, if that's the case, if we already have the motor units recruited, let's say 3 reps before those last 5 reps, do we really need to get that close to failure, or would we be fine staying like 8 reps away from failure if all the motor units are recruited already?
Well, it depends. Like, if say your 10 RM is where your upper recruitment threshold is, and this is what I mean, is about people really struggle with this. They have it in their head that failure seems to be the only thing that seems to drive motor unit recruitment. They don't seem to realize that that's with light to moderate loads, but with the rep ranges that people tend to do, you know, the classic 8 to 12 is you're virtually right at, if not over, the upper recruitment threshold for motor units. Now, the thing is, if you only do, if say the upper recruitment threshold is 10 reps, if you have 8 reps in reserve, you just do 2. What do you do then? Wait 2 minutes before you do 2 more. You're going to be there all day before you, again, it comes back to accumulating the volume. So what type of volume are you accumulating unless you spend an awful amount of time? But again, it's kind of like cluster sets. Probably the best, the thing that have found the best overall setup is rest redistribution. Have you heard of that before?
No.
It's a little bit like cluster sets, except for it's a wee bit more simple than that. So within cluster sets, you'll do your set of, say, instead of just doing 10 reps straight, you might do 5 clusters of 2 reps, but you might do 2 reps, wait 20 seconds, do another 2 reps, wait 20 seconds, and so on until you've done your 10 reps. So you do that 5 times, and then you take your rest interval. Rest redistribution is kind of a mix between the two, where you might say, if you've done 10 reps, you might do, and you have, say, if you do 10 reps, say you have a 4-minute rest interval. Rest redistribution is you might do 5 of those, rest 2 minutes, and then do the other 5. So actually you've done the 10 reps, and then when you rest again and do the next 5 reps, you've accumulated the same volume in the same amount of time. You've done the 10 reps plus your total of 4 minutes rest in between. So that's what rest redistribution is. And I've found that because, again, the recovery of the neuromuscular, and that's why I said neuromuscular recovery is linked to metabolism, and how quickly we can resynthesize ATP and phosphocreatine stores and things like that. If you redistribute your rest time so that you're doing a certain amount of reps, probably only half the amount that still are above the upper recruitment threshold and recruiting all the motor units, then take a bit of a break and then do the same amount again, you actually use heavier loads than you would do if you were doing them the 10 straight. Okay, you will say you're using 100 kilos for the 10 straight, you'll probably use 107.5, 110 kilos to do those reps. So you've accumulated more volume doing it that way as well. And that's because the metabolism, neuromuscular recovery and linked to metabolism is very acute and rapid immediately and kind of tails off a wee bit over time. So that actually means is when you do rest redistribution and you don't go to failure, is you can recover quite quickly from that. All your motor units are ready, excitation, contraction, coupling's not going to be an issue again, and you can lift heavier loads than you would do if you'd done a straight set. So that's what I have found. We're trialing over 15 to 20 years of different sets configurations and taking in all the different aspects of theory that I know has been the best muscle building, and also in terms of recovery to allow you to do further sessions within the week, so your frequency is really strong with it as well. So getting back to what you originally said about the rep, just doing 2 reps and leaving like 8 in reserve, just practically that falls down. I would probably say you absolutely do not need to go to complete failure, in my opinion. Absolutely do not. And I've never seen any convincing evidence that you do for muscle size. I think to accumulate the good volume, because again, most upper motor unit recruitment thresholds are around 80 to 85%. So once you do 6 to 8 or maybe 8 to 10 reps, depending on the muscle group that it, these upper recruitment thresholds are different between different muscles. Once you've done this certain amount of volume, you can just cut it there anywhere between 2 and 4 reps, depending on the amount of total reps that you're doing. Cut it at 2 to 4, no problem. Get your rest in and go again. And that will get you as good as hypertrophy as any other going to failure will.
It's very popular right now, actually, to do very low rep ranges. I think people go as low as 2 reps. Like the range that they like to do is 4 to 2 or 2 to 4. And I also do that, and it's fun just because you're lifting heavy. But I think people also don't want to worry too much. So they get confused with this idea of time under tension, like how I said it, that maybe we have to generate force for a sufficient amount of time. But as you stated, it's more likely the volume accumulating. And if you just do a 1 rep max, it's very hard to accumulate sufficient volume. And that's probably why in research we don't really see much growth, because they're like, well, if we do 10 reps for 1 set or something, and 1 set of 10 reps, obviously maybe the 1 rep max might need more volume to match, something like that.
Yeah, well, essentially, if you compare that to, say, 3 sets of 10, you've got 30 reps in there. If it's above the upper recruitment threshold, you've got 30 really good reps where you recruited all your motor units to do the task. And then you do a 1 RM. If it takes you 3 minutes to recover enough strength to do that 1 RM, that's going to take you 90 minutes to accumulate the same volume as doing it in, say, just 10, 12 minutes. So none of the studies do that. They're not going to equate for volume because of the time differential. That takes absolutely far too long.
Practically, it's not very fun to try to do that. So I don't think people should. Do you think people should fear, or not fear, but maybe no longer strive to go to a slower velocity? Because you've probably heard, if your speed isn't slowing down, you're not training hard enough. Well, it's like, well, if speed slowing down is more so like a compensation mechanism for your body to continue performing the task, maybe we don't have to reach that point of slower velocity. Maybe we can reach a point near there, and that should be enough.
Yeah, so as I explained, the force and velocity relationship has changed under fatigue due to those ADP accumulation and excitation, contraction, coupling failure. But also, what I wanted to make a real point is, people seem to think the tempo at which they do resistance training, I've seen a lot of social media saying those reps are being performed too fast and you need to slow down. One, people don't understand that what you see happening, whole muscle length changes at a joint, that is not representative of how quickly a muscle fiber actually shortens. So they're completely different things, largely, especially in pinnate muscles, which most of the muscles usually we train in the gym are pinnate muscles. There is a decoupling between muscle length changes and muscle fiber changes. Muscles know they are bad at producing force at high velocities. Muscles know they are bad at producing force with lots of length changes as well. So when you study the geometric setup of muscles and how they're designed, it is absolutely amazing, because they function so well to minimize length and velocity changes, because of the debilitating effects of those on their force potential. They do not actually change length or velocity very much compared to what a whole muscle does. So the fibers actually don't change length and velocity anywhere near as much as you might think they do based on the whole muscle length. So anyway, when people are performing resistance training, they might think the tempo is particularly high, but muscles gear differently, and the actual amount of fiber shortening is usually at a ratio lower than the whole muscle level. So our muscles, if they were freely, could freely, if you could see freely their maximum shortening velocities, in some of our smallest muscles, you're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 degrees per second. Okay, that is incredibly fast, how fast they can go. Some of their larger muscles, you're still talking, in the quadriceps, you're probably talking somewhere between 500, 600, and 700 degrees per second. And then you've people talking about people performing resistance training at maybe 90 degrees per second or something like that, being really, really fast, as if they think that's way over on the force velocity relationship. It's not, and remember, that's even at the whole muscle level. So it's even slower again on the muscle fiber level. So I think people's perception even of where they're actually performing resistance training is completely skewed versus what their muscle fibers feel, and this feeling that they have to slow everything down so much, or let it, that what you call unintentional or unconscious slowing, and let essentially the muscle do. But that's the muscle fatigue is slowing the muscle. So yeah, but the muscle fibers themselves are already contracting pretty slowly, and even when you actually reach isometric, you have to take in the properties of the tendon as well, because isometric contractions aren't even completely isometric. They're shortening velocities with isometric contractions as well. So I think people's understanding of how muscles function at a fiber level versus what they see at a whole muscle level versus what they see a joint doing. People will look at a joint moving quite fast, or something like that, but the actual total muscle excursion isn't huge. But they see like the likes of maybe the wrist going through large excursions, and that's what they think the muscle's actually doing when it's not. So there's all those disproportionate ideas of the force velocity relationship slowing down, how that then affects muscle fiber force, etc. Or there's large misconceptions around those.
Well, do you think that muscles were designed, or the fibers were designed to minimize speed? Because if they're slower, there's higher chance that these cross bridges will attach, allowing it to generate that sufficient force. And I think that's what people think, that like as you slow down, therefore more cross bridges attach, and therefore you generate more force, making them think that when you go slow in a rep, more force is generated.
Yeah, well, again, that's what they think because they don't appreciate how slow the actual fibers and cross bridges are actually going at a time. And cross bridges are slow. The muscle is so slow. I mean, it is absolutely, and that's what I mean. You have to appreciate when you do unravel the design of a muscle down through the different layers of structure, is that it knows that the cross bridging and everything like that is incredibly slow, and it can't afford to let things happen at a high rate. But that's just not the same thing as people are associating with their resistance training movement velocities and actual muscle fiber velocities, because they are relatively slow anyway. And they just don't understand the decoupling between, like I say, that whole muscle and muscle fiber level velocities. But that's what I mean. It is, the muscles are absolutely designed not to change length a lot and to change speed a lot, because the nature of their mechanics is so slow. They don't want that to happen, and that's when you really appreciate the ingenious structure of muscle.
So, speaking of velocity, there's some research emerging that I've been seeing that, plyometrics, for example, have been seen to build muscle. And with plyometrics, we see high degrees of motor unit recruitment or firing rates, one could argue.
Definitely firing rates more than motor unit recruitment. Definitely.
So, people use that argument saying like, well, if motor units are really that important for hypertrophy, how come we don't see plyometrics build similar muscle to resistance training? Because in plyometrics, we see, high activation or whatever. So we would expect to see, muscle growth with high degrees of motor unit recruitment.
Yeah, so definitely when you look at any sort of ballistic powerful contraction, the neural strategy is different. It switches from high motor unit recruitment to with some so probably between 40 and 80% of MVC is very much motor unit recruitment dominant change in force. That motor unit recruitment's the dominant strategy that the neuromuscular system uses to change its force output. But in between those, those finer things, there is slight changes in firing rate. But lower than that and above that, it's all firing rate. But when you come to a powerful contraction, is the motor units, you don't have time to recruit as many as you would like. So the firing rates of those motor units increase drastically. So that's the only way, that's the muscle's best way of allowing higher force generation. Decrease the actual amount of motor units involved, but increase the firing rates. And like I said, the increase in firing rate has the same effect as it allows more calcium into the cell to allow all the cross bridges to form and muscle force to be produced. So it's a different strategy, but you're still seeing muscle force ultimately produced by cross bridges, and you're still getting mechanical tension. But you can't. Often these arguments are not if you can build muscle with plyometrics and if you can build muscle with resistance training. It's what's the best strategy. Now, if somebody is going to argue with me that you will build just as much muscle over time using plyometrics and ballistic exercises as slower, heavier, it's more standard resistance training, I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's a lot of research would support that. There is some, but some of the research is in older populations. Some of the research is in other populations, not well-trained athletic populations or anything like that. So yeah, again, it's not a if other methods can build muscle, but it's just weighing up what is the best or optimal if you're looking to optimize muscle size.
And I mean, with high speeds, whenever you do like light loads, for example, a 30 rep max, so high reps, the first few are like very light, so the speed would probably be really fast. As we get closer to that failure point, it's not, people think that, we're generating more force, but it could be that we're just generating the same amount of force with those, slow twitch fiber types. Why would we need to recruit more? Are those slow twitch fiber types getting fatigued as we go on? And
yeah,
even they're really
so essentially the slow twitch fiber types get fatigued or recycled. They either drop out and come back in at a later stage, or there's a couple of different theories. It's not really well particularly nuanced and known completely, but you have either motor units drop out and come back in, or they drop out and have to recover. But essentially, that's it. Once those slower motor units start dropping out because they can no longer sustain the level of force needed, even for a light load, that's when you'll get the size principle kicking in. And well, sorry, not really the size principle, but you have to drag in your type 2A and type 2X eventually motor units, and you'll get an almost complete full motor unit recruitment with light load training to failure. And that's again the recruitment threshold kicking in, is you have those available to bring into the scenario, because you're under light loads, you're nowhere near the upper recruitment threshold. So if you're doing 40 or 50% MVC, you've got all your probably type 1 motor units on board, or low threshold, should we say, motor units on board, probably starting to tap into type 2A and around then. But from then on in, you've still got a serious amount of motor units that you haven't really tapped into yet. So as fatigue progresses, they can bring those on board, and then that's what happens.
And once we activate those type 2, we could probably perform a few 3 more reps with those type 2s, generating high forces before they begin to fatigue, allowing us to accumulate
Yeah,
volume.
yeah. Like the velocity and the force is still dropping, because you have, again, the ADP accumulating to slow the velocity of this all down in those muscle fibers. But even though you've got your type 2 fibers, which produce, if you have the cross section of one type 2X fiber versus a type 1, it produces somewhere between 60 to 100% of the type 1 fiber, if they're exactly the same cross-sectional area. So although they're a lot stronger, is you've just got a lot of other motors dropped out at that stage, just not contributing to the force. So that's why you don't really get stronger feeling as such as you go through towards fatigue. It's just because you've lost a load of motor units, and you've fewer, like you've a hell of a lot fewer type 2X fibers to take up that force load. So that's what's happening essentially. But there are so there's some nice work been done a few years ago. I don't remember the author now, but they looked at so if you that's what I said, you probably get an almost complete set of motor units recruited at fatigue with light loads, but potentially not the full set, because there's research been shown when they compared the motor unit action potentials of individual motor units and the composition of those motor units from a 90% effort, which is obviously going to be at or basically at or superseding that motor unit upper recruitment threshold. And then they compared them to the last reps of 50% MVC to fatigue. They found that there was less higher threshold motor units recruited at the light loaded fatigue condition versus a 90% MVC, which is why this comes down to personal preference. If you like doing light loads at failure, knock yourself out, no problem. But I'm not a fan of doing them myself if I'm looking to potentially maximize hypertrophy in the long run, is that you don't probably get all of the type 2 motor units involved at that stage.
And I mean, I guess that could be a conversation for another time, whether light loads and heavy loads produce equal growth, as that could be, there's a lot of debate on that. But I do want to hop into some of your papers on lengthened partials, which is a big thing. At least it was a big thing, but I think it might come back, whether training in the stretch is important. So to kind of break a little understanding of how people look at this, is that they believe that the benefits from training in the lengthened stage, so like having the load or having the resistance be highest where the muscle is in a more lengthened position relative to what it was before, is that the benefits we get, or why we see greater muscle growth, is because we add sarcomeres in series. I'm not fond of that. I'm not completely convinced of that. But they say that, so if a muscle, both of these reasons come down to the length tension relationship of a muscle, right? So the first reason is that if a muscle primarily acts mostly on the ascending limb, its fibers or its sarcomeres do not dig deep enough into the descending limb to generate sufficient passive tension, and therefore create this benefit of adding sarcomeres in series, or this hypertrophic benefit in general. The other theory is that if the muscle acts primarily on the ascending limb, then it benefits more from being trained at the longer length because it generates less force in a shorter length. Now, these two theories contradict each other because, I mean, if one of them is acting on the near the descending limb, like let's say the quads, people like to say that the quads act primarily in the descending limb. Therefore, when you train them in a lengthened state, they grow because their sarcomeres reach to the descending limb. But the biceps, for example, they don't really act near that. They act more in the ascending limb. And how we spoke before, they don't really change much length. So they can't really benefit from this stretch. But I mean, this other theory is like, well, look at the gastrocs. They act on the ascending limb, but they benefit more from the stretch. So could it be that they just don't generate a lot of force in the shortened position and generate more force in the lengthened position? So nonetheless, this theory of muscles benefiting from being trained at longer length is just solely looked at in the concept of the length tension relationship. But in your paper, you mentioned other factors that could be at play. So I don't know if you want to hop in on that and
Yeah, well, I suppose this is social media's influencers theories, because ultimately I proposed lengthened partials first, so it's them taking their own views on this, on what the theory is, because I don't see they haven't proposed a theory first and then my papers came after or anything like that. So what I primarily based lengthened partials on, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, dynamically as well, rather than isometrics. People have different muscle fiber lengths, so we make a huge amount of assumptions about where they're at on their force length relationships and what their length tension relationships are based on some research done on joint angles. But people can have, again, when you measure it and you're in a position to measure this, you will see how vastly different the absolute lengths of people's fascicles can be within the same muscle group. So in my PhD, I had people who had, and again, once you normalize that to femur length as well, you had people with close to 30, 40, 50% difference in the absolute length of their fascicles in the same portion of the muscle belly in the same muscle. So you can't automatically just say the quads operate on this part of the length tension relationship and this is what you mean and this is what training will do for you. So that's why I was more inclined to go through lengthened partials dynamically or certain range of motion rather than saying like isometrically training at this discrete joint angle, because you can never say a single joint angle is going to be optimal for a certain amount of people. But anyway, so if we talk about the quadriceps specifically, they're on pretty much the ascending limb if you take the knee being fully extended, and then as we start working back towards bending the knee, around somewhere between 60 and 70, maybe even 75 degrees there on the plateau area. There's a range of joint angles there, the peak and the force. And then after that, we start going down the descending limb, probably just north of 70 degrees from there on. Now, the quadriceps, you can get to knee angles of about 160 degrees if you're very flexible or if somebody's really flexing your quads big time. So they have a huge range of motion that they can get through. So when they're at, say, 90 degrees, they are kind of just over halfway of their total amount of excursion that they can go through. And they're just over that sort of plateau of the length tension relationship heading down the descending limb. So when I proposed lengthened partials, it was to cover the approximate area of the length tension relationship that you'd get the greatest force full stop produced by sarcomeres. There's no doubt that if you train between 50 and 90 degrees or so, or 50 and 100 degrees, it's not that exact, you will encapsulate the highest plateau of the ascending limb, plateau of the force length relationship, and catch the edge of the descending limb. You're producing the highest forces there that the quads can reduce. Because actually the VL and the, for example, the VL and the VM don't have the same sarcomere lengths either. So that's why we have to talk about the quads. You have to think about they're not actually all even on the same portions of the length tension curve. So that would encapsulate the highest forces of the VM as well. So there's that aspect, the actual force producing aspect. Then you would have, because it's on the descending limb, you may have the beginnings of the development of some passive tension, as you'll see in the classic length tension relationship, both active and passive. And then also the sarcomeres. So that and that passive tension is coming from the passive elements as well, such as tighten. But then you've got the actual stretch is slightly different. You know that the actual length of the sarcomere is actually stretched. So when you're talking about sarcomeres being stretched, or and this is what it's been quite confusing on social media, is they're not what I would call being stretched on the ascending limb at all, because they're not really reaching the long enough length. But what they are doing is moving to a much higher force generating capability. So in order to build muscle, we have a hell of a lot of mechanotransducers knocking about our cells, a lot of different mechanisms. So we're talking about passive tension, we're talking about actual stretch of the sarcomere, and that interacts with extracellular matrix, and that signal can be brought back in. We have to bring in tendon stiffness on this as well, because the tendon links to that extracellular matrix, and a compliant tendon will not be as stiff, obviously, as a stiff tendon. So a compliant tendon will allow a lot more give in the extracellular matrix versus a stiff tendon as well. So you have to take those properties into account. So we're left now with sort of, in the quadriceps, you have good active force over that range of motion, 50 to 90 degrees, 50 to 100 degrees. You have passive tension starting to develop in the passive elements. You have stretch of the actual sarcomeres beyond their optimal overlap. You have probably input from the extracellular matrix at that point, and then finally the muscle activation of the quadriceps is highest in and around somewhere between 50 and 90 degrees, because people don't tend to go into those intermediate lengths either. So you have pretty much, when you look at all the mechanotransduction pathways and all the different clients, your integrins, you've got your costomeres, you've got all the different pathways, molecular pathways. When you take those kind of 4 factors in, you've covered a hell of a lot of all the mechanotransductory pathways and where the signaling can come from. You haven't crossed them all, because there are a couple of other ones, but you've got your stretch activated ion channels in there as well. So the quads is one of them really fantastic examples where over a range of a few joint angles, you've got an almost perfect storm of mechanical signals that are going to be hitting those cells. Once you go past that, you start to see drop-offs, certainly in active force production as you head down that descending limb. You do see eventually a general, you're still seeing an increase in the passive element tension. Again, curvilinear increase like that as the muscle goes to longer lengths. But it's not clear because again, the total tension of the sarcomere is still actually on a bit of a dip until the passive tension gets seriously high and then brings total sarcomere lengths or total sarcomere tension back up again. But if you go past those sort of joint angles on the descending limb, you're probably not going to get down to those really high sarcomere lengths potentially, where that passive tension is going to really ramp total sarcomere tension right the whole way back up again. You're probably just going to sit in that dip a wee bit between and the trade-off between passive and active tension. But when we look at, for example, Tom Burkholder's work on the downstream effects of all those mechanotransductory cascades, you'll see that actually there's a specific activation of downstream targets between active tension and stretch or passive tension. And it seems to be that the P70S6K downstream target is specifically activated with the sort of active force or more lateral tension signaling cascade. But some of the signaling cascades between active and we'll say a stretch or passive tension, they converge and result in similar anabolic pathway stimuli, and others stay separate. So it looks like what you'd call multi-axial strain, that is the sarcomere being deformed in two different directions, probably provides the most holistic stimulus for the cell then to go through those protein synthesis mechanotransductory cascades. So that's really what it was based on. And then you've got, like I say, the activation in there as well, which is going to be potentially maximizing the total amount of motor units involved. But again, when we measure that, so that's done voluntary activation. So that's done by Tom Folland's group over there in Loughborough. They showed really nicely in 2017 between the different joint angles, the voluntary activation was much higher at 90 degrees and 50 degrees and 30 degrees, and still higher than 110 degrees. So again, when you're going down the descending limb, your voluntary activation levels are going down as well. So that's why I proposed that. I don't know why people used to say to me, which really used to annoy me, because the quads, you can obviously go into deep squat, and so people said that's not the full range of motion. 90 degrees isn't the full range of motion, and they just completely misunderstood. I'm not saying 90 degrees is a full range of motion for the quadriceps, but I'm saying it's the optimal range of motion. So that's why I don't like them called lengthened partials and stuff as well. I actually prefer them to be called optimal partials, where you're trying to optimize all the different mechanical variables into the portion of the joint torque angle relationship where they come together the best. So that's really what they are. And then you've got the follow-on studies that have been shown. There's multiple studies over the last 20 years have shown that once you go past 90, 100 degrees, it doesn't confer any more quadricep size. So there must be something in and around that theory that's pretty close to being right to some degree. And then also you need to appreciate with different exercises and different muscles how synergists how they kick in and out at different joint angles as well and stuff like that there. So when people tend to look at force length relationships in isolation of just the one muscle, but around different joints, we have multiple muscles contributing to the in vivo load share at any one point, and we have to be wary of that as well. So there's a lot more thought than people would actually probably think than just saying, oh, the muscle is more stretched or in a longer length. The second thing about what you say, maybe the calves and the ascending limb of the force length relationship, and why I say stretch to a sarcomere is a very specific term, like I say, If it's beyond its optimal overlap, then it's kind of being stretched. If it's on the ascending limb, the sarcomeres aren't stretched really, but they might be still be getting some sort of passive tension from the passive elements. So there was a study done this year by Bize, done in the Journal of Applied Physiology, and they trained eccentrically at longer and shorter muscle lengths. And they found that the eccentric contractions performed at the longer muscle length were the only the two conditions that resulted in an increase in fascicle length. But those increases in fascicle length were fairly small and only found at when the muscle was at its slack level. Okay, they weren't found at any other joint angles. There was about 10 or 15 joint angles. I can't remember. They looked at a load of joint angles, ankle joint angles, but it was only at the very start, at the very slackest of the muscle lengths, that they found a slight increase in the fascicle length. So that would also kind of intimate that on the ascending limb, you're not getting this really strong serial sarcomere genesis signal from passive tension or from stretch of sarcomeres or whatever, because they never kind of really get there much. And then you twin that with the Cassiano study done a couple of years in the calves that showed the medial gastroc. So basically they trained the calves and gained shorter and longer muscle lengths. Longer muscle lengths doesn't mean a long muscle length, it was just longer. They're both on the ascending limb. Maganara showed that the gastrocs almost exclusively during resistance type exercise perform on the ascending limb. So it basically divided the ascending limb into two. You went from very short lengths to moderately short lengths in the short muscle length condition, and in the longer muscle length condition, you went from about halfway up the ascending limb to the sort of plateau or end of the ascending limb stroke plateau of the force length relationship. And what they found is the medial gastroc grew much better than the shorter muscle length group and than the full range of motion as well. But you look at the total average force that by maintaining at those few joint angles, the active force production is so much higher than at those other two. The average active force production was at those other two configurations or full range of motion, and the short muscle length is the active force was just so high. So that it would also tell you that active force was playing a really strong part in this kind of optimal partials resistance training strategy.
So that makes sense with the quads and the calves, that maybe when we do these lengthened partials, we want to incorporate a little bit of the passive benefits, but not so much. Like, let's say if we're deep squatting, we lose so much of the active benefits of the active force generation that the increase in passive may not be enough to offset that loss of active. And as you mentioned with Thomas Burkholder, maybe the active signaling cascades could be more beneficial than the passive, just because we generate more force actively. Other reasons?
Yeah, that's where we would need a huge amount of studies done. It is a very, very hugely complex area, and you need a series of studies done from the whole muscle level down right through all those structures down to mechanotransduction and cellular responses. What we don't really know is, again, what I'd say the magnitude of response to active force versus that passive force or stretch forces, and what the different mechanisms associated in. So is the opening of stretch ion activated channels, is the effect of tight and stretched on Z discs like to the costomere, is the magnitude of the signal for hypertrophy the same between lateral force transmission? That's a key question, is do they result in the same total amount of protein synthesis and downstream effectors? You would probably think that there might be different magnitudes of hypertrophy potentially, or magnitudes of signals potentially, because they're not always additive. If you add in more, but that's probably because they converge also on downstream effectors as well, like I said before. So it's just not really clear which part of the stimulus results in X amount of hypertrophy or X contribution to the total hypertrophy observed. So that's kind of, I think, where we're at there is, how much of the total hypertrophic response does force or lateral force transmission contribute to it? How much does all these other mechanisms contribute to it? How much are they additive? How much are they kind of redundant? Because if you've stimulated one, doesn't matter if you stimulate the rest, the job's done with a downstream target. We just don't know all those questions yet. It's very, very complex to unfold all that.
Yeah, and I mean, with the quads and the calves, it could be, like you said, this perfect storm of these factors that allow these muscles to generate high forces at these joint angles, which is why maybe doing these optimal partials, as you call them, maybe better than just needing to do this full range of motion of the exercise. Now, with the biceps, those seem to be interesting because those seem to show equal growth with it with the entire range, whether it's short or lengthened. So do you have any theories on why that might be?
Yeah, and there's a couple of really funny things that I see with the biceps that haven't really seen in other muscles. So basically, I know a lot of people will say Bayesian curls, let's extend the shoulder back, because what that's going to do is lengthen the muscle, versus something like a preacher curl, which will put the shoulder forward and or flex the shoulder and then put the muscle at a shorter length. But again, even when I'm talking about the quads there, and I did talk previously about the tendons properties as well, and extracellular matrix stiffness and all that, all of, and this is where it also is so complex, is all of your muscles are constantly within a muscle tendon complex, and the properties of the tendons will also dictate what happens at the muscle fiber levels as well. So if you have a compliant tendon, and all of our tendons, especially the Achilles, patella tendons, stuff like that, because they're energy return, storage and return tendons. Like, so say, even if just go back to the quads and the likes of the calves for a second, is when you rotate those joints passively, a lot of the length change isn't actually taken by the muscle up to nearly sort of 30, 40, even maybe 50 degrees of the first part of passive rotation of the knee, the tendon, and the same with the ankle, the tendon takes all that slack. So it does, the muscles, fascicles aren't actually really changing length much at all. And that's the effect a compliant tendon can have. So in the likes of the biceps tendons are quite long. So they're long compliant tendons up there in the shoulder, the top of the shoulder. And one of the first things I did, so like, it's funny when I hear these social media debates about what works in lengthened partials or optimal partials, but what works and what doesn't work, because I've been doing this for 15 years at this stage, so I know what works and what doesn't work. So when I seen the biceps thing coming in, it made me laugh, because I looked at this almost 10 years ago, and I think I told you way before that data came out was that you're not going to see really any better growth by extending the shoulder backward. And that's really because the compliance of the biceps tendon is significant. And when you extend your shoulder back, a lot of the length change of the muscle tendon complex is actually just taken by the biceps tendons. And so you don't get the actual fascicles lengthened a huge amount. And therefore some of the muscle fibers pull back to longer lengths towards the maybe plateau of the force length relationship, because at rest, the sarcomeres are kind of up towards a plateau, but as soon as you put any tension on them, they're going to shorten back down the ascending limb. So by the time your muscle or your arms fully extended, they are down the ascending limb a wee bit. So if you try to stretch them back into a slightly longer muscle length towards the plateau, it's not really happening much. You're not getting that big massive, like you've seen in the calves. You're not getting that big massive differential in force. You're probably only getting very, very little changes in force, in active force contribution anyway. And if the tendon's compliant, you're probably not getting a huge amount of other tension from the extracellular matrix either, that stretch you're looking for. So that would, from my perspective, be certainly some of the considerations why we're not seeing, the longer muscle length, and because you're not really getting the longer muscle lengths by extending the shoulder. And that's actually, I measured that. I looked at the fascicles in an inclined bicep curl position versus just a neutral position, and there was virtually no difference at all in the fascicles. And they're big, long fascicles as well. In the biceps, the muscle fibers run almost the entire length of the fascicle, and the fascicles run almost the entire length of the whole muscle length as well. So yeah, you're just not getting the assumed change that everybody thinks. And again, if you're in an inclined curl position, so you're on a bench, you got the bench back by say 45 degrees, shoulders behind you, extended, and you're curling the dumbbell through the same, from full elbow extension to say it's sort of 80-90 degrees. If you were working at a more optimal muscle length, you should see, because you haven't changed gravity's effects. Gravity's still acting vertically through you as you would be if you're doing a standard curl. But virtually everybody, nobody lifts more weight doing an incline curl than they do doing a standard curl. You always have to drop a few kilos off. And that's the other, something you probably get some sort of pretty bad feedback off the shoulder. The shoulder really doesn't like being back there at all. And one of the things that I mentioned is a bit funny about the biceps is probably overall the best biceps exercise that I've done is actually, and it's backed up by some degree of evidence as well, is actually when you flex the shoulder to about 70 or 80 degrees, so you're actually leaning, one of the ways to do it is to lean right the way forward, you somehow generate and can lift a lot more weight in that position than you can either doing a Bayesian curl or even what do you call it with the shoulder flexed? What do you call them? I can't believe.
Preacher curls?
Preacher curl, where it tends to be maybe sort of 30-40 degrees. You can generate for the same not the 90 degrees of elbow flexion a hell of a lot more muscle force. Now there is biceps AMG activation evidence to show that actually at that those joint angles, 70 to 80 degrees of shoulder flexion, you have the highest EMG amplitudes there versus other joint angles. What I will say is the methodology of that paper isn't fantastic in terms of EMG methodologies. That's why I'm not saying it's fantastic, and it shows you this completely. I'd have preferred to see some more rigorous EMG methodologies in that paper, but for what it's worth, it does show higher EMG amplitudes than any other joint angle in that position, and you would be surprised how much extra weight you can actually lift there. So there's a type of curl that I do that I've been doing for quite a while now. I just don't have time to do the social media videos to show it. But even if you go back to a lot of, and I'm not going to qualify this by saying because who does it, and because there's a lot of times bodybuilders do terrible exercises. So I'm not saying that, but one of the staples of certainly Arnold's bicep work was a standing but bent over bicep curl. So essentially like a concentration curl. You're not standing but completely almost bent over. So he is very close to that 70, 80 degrees. And that was one of the first exercises he done right the whole way through his career from he was 17 onwards that he said he loved. And that's just because he noticed fine rightly he could lift far more weight going through the same joint angles at any other positions. So yeah, there's that one, and that is pretty effective for bicep muscle growth that I don't think people are too aware of.
Well, that's interesting because, well, even without the movement of the shoulder, if we just do elbow flexion and extension, right, having the shoulder stay still, the biceps still grow similarly. So maybe just the change in fascicle length probably isn't enough to do much. But with the curl variation you were saying, it sounds a lot like a spider curl. Like, I don't know if you ever seen people kind of like lean over and like have the
Yeah,
pad like right under here, have them be like at 90
yeah,
degrees and then curl.
yeah. It depends. Usually the spider curls are actually, so most people will probably put the bench somewhere between 45 and 60 degrees. That's actually the point where you get the lowest EMG amplitudes and some of the lowest torque outputs as well. So there's a bit of a funny relationship where from a neutral position going through shoulder flexion, it starts off high, goes through a dip, and then comes back up. And then actually, once you go past 70 to 80 degrees to 90 degrees, it starts to go down again. So it's actually a pretty almost S-shaped curve. So there's a range of joint angles. Once you go past, those sort of normal preacher curl angles, that there's that dip where probably a lot of people actually do their spider curls in. That's actually a lot lower than you would get from just doing a standard neutral one, or the one I was just talking about, sort of 70, 80 degrees.
I think a lot of people, why they stop doing things like spider curls is because they fear that as we get into higher degrees of shoulder flexion, we get into active insufficiency, which reduces the muscle's force output. And I think that's why people don't like doing like high degrees of shoulder flexion and curls. And also, if you do like a spider curl, you will see that like you get a much bigger pump. So like metabolites accumulate a lot more. So they think that, fatigue is another big factor there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on like this active insufficiency and like this greater pump accumulation that's going on.
Well, yeah, like I say, you've got potentially what could be active insufficiency, but that's obviously not suggesting what some of this EMG work is. But if you were getting active sufficiency, you wouldn't be stronger in that position than you are in all the rest of the joint angles. So this is kind of sort of, let's set all the theory and understanding exactly what exactly is happening here. But if you can lift a lot more weight in a joint angle, why are you going to deny what's happening in front of your face because your brain doesn't understand how or why that's happening? in terms of your understanding of how or why that's happening. But all as I know is you can put some serious torque together at those joint angles, far higher than any other of the angles. Maybe you're talking 15 to 20% more. And there is that bit of evidence from the EMG. But like I say, it could be tightened up a lot with its methods.
Maybe. And I guess to finish off this this podcast, the last point I wanted to touch on was this principle of neuromechanical matching. So, for example, another theory why they say that the biceps don't grow at longer lengths is because that their leverage was lower at those longer lengths. So, for example, that their leverage is low. So their internal moment arm, their ability to their mechanical advantage is lower at those longer lengths. So they can't generate as much force. So the brain wants to recruit a muscle that has a greater mechanical advantage than one with a weaker one. Now, what I would think as well is that where if a muscle has less of a mechanical advantage, I feel like it would receive more neural input from the brain because it has to generate more force to equate the torque at the joint angle. But then there's also the confusion of like, well, if we're at max intensity, all muscles that are in the task are already generating as much force. So that already kind of cancels out, is what is suggested. Like, all right, well, that doesn't make sense. So there is that huge discrepancy there. I don't know if you have anything to touch on any of that.
We probably need another 45 minutes to go through all of this.
Do you have the time,
This is
or?
well, it's coming up not far from midnight over here, and so I wouldn't have time. We could maybe do a different, come back again at some other stage to visit it more in depth, maybe. But there's a lot to unpack. So this is based obviously on the principle of neuromechanical matching paper done by Hudson a couple of years ago. This whole neuromechanical matching thing for me is a uniquely generated social media storm because it's the misapplication of that theory to resistance training and resistance training for hypertrophy that is the issue. Categorically, in that paper, the authors state there is no relationship between the mechanical advantage as defined by the length of the internal moment arm of the muscle around the joint and muscle activation. Yet that is the yardstick that everybody uses for neuromechanical matching. So whether they've even read the paper or whether they've just heard another social media influencer and they're just parroting it because they think they're a science-based lifter, I don't know. But at the very end of the section where it says evidence of neuromechanical matching in non-respiratory muscles, that is in black and white at the very end of that paragraph. So already you've just went off on a tangent on your own at that stage, because the authors of the paper have categorically stated that there's no relationship between the internal moment arm length and neuromechanical matching and muscle activation. So we're already kind of talking about two different things already, but there's just, if we actually just talk about maybe a wee bit of the limitations of the application of that paper, if you even read it and understood it properly, maybe it'll give some people a better idea of the misapplication of the theory to actually resistance training. So if you look at the example in the paper that they give, they look at the soleus and the gastroc muscles. They define mechanical advantage as the change in muscle length per degree of passive rotation of the joint. Okay. That's not the same as an internal moment arm length, obviously. So mechanical advantage versus what social media is using, which is internal moment arm length, is actually completely different to what the authors of that paper is using. So they're also, so that's a passive at, joint rotation at rest. There's no active force contribution from the muscle. So the example that they use is the soleus and the gastrocs, and say basically that the gastrocs pick up a mechanical advantage based on I think it's the Kawakami paper from the mid-90s, who did all the fascicle lengths at different joint angles. And then they compare that to the Cresswell paper from about 1995 as well, or maybe 97, looking at motor unit changes over the joint angles as well. So it's problematic when you're taking mechanical behavior of fascicles, which is very different between different people, from one study and using it to provide evidence of the mechanical behavior to compare to AMG motor unit behavior in another study. That should be done within the same population for a start, really ideally, because then you can match the motor unit behavior to the mechanical behavior straight up. So in that, they show that basically as the gastrocs gain mechanical advantage, how they would measure it, that it's not that motor units weren't recruited or couldn't be recruited. There was just a delay, okay? A delay of a few seconds. And the delay was because the increase in the soleus basically the soleus AMG increased to a higher degree when the rest of those other gastroc motor units came on board. That was done at a ramp protocol going towards 40 Newton meters of torque. Okay. If you're looking at the triceps suram muscle group and in a normal healthy young person, that is probably equating to anywhere between 20, 25, if you're being generous, 30% MVC. Okay. But the thing is, a lot of the principle of neuromechanical matching is about the order in which the motor units are recruited, not that they're recruited at all or not. So that's what they showed. They basically showed that all the motor units came on board. They just came on board at a relatively higher activation level of the soleus compared to the gastrocs. But they're at such low force levels that that doesn't matter. In resistance training that's done at much higher intensities, that the order is changed at very low levels. That scenario is not really applicable, because the motor units still came on board very readily as force levels increased slightly. The big problem with this is also linked to that. There is activation dependent behavior in our muscles, and it was published. The most recent paper was published just a few days ago in the Journal of Physiology by Sebastian Bohm and the Arampatsis group. And they showed in the soleus, funnily enough, that the level, so activation dependent behavior of muscle means that as you go through different levels of activation, it changes the mechanical behavior of the fascicles and the torque producing capacity, and it shifts the length tension relationship. So they showed that at 100% MVC, the optimal muscle fiber length, but as you went down to 60% MVC and the activation associated with it, there was a right shift to longer muscle lengths of the force length relationship. So the optimal muscle length shifted by about 6.5% to longer muscle lengths. Then when you drop down to 30%, it shifted out to almost 10% of the original optimal fiber length. So you can already see the issues with defining mechanical advantage as a passive rotation and the length change around the muscle between an activated muscle, which we get during resistance training, the length changes that then confers, and then those length changes are going to affect obviously the mechanical advantage as well. So that's just a small proportion of the limitations in dragging the principle of neuromechanical matching into a higher intensity resistance training environment. There's a lot more, but that's just a flavor of it.
Yeah, I know you have some videos. For those of you interested, you have I think a few videos going over a
Yeah,
little bit
but
more.
again, they're just the tip of the iceberg as well. I didn't do go through all the different things on those videos as well, but it will give you a flavor of the limitations. But particularly, again, it's the authors never proposed this for resistance training. The authors never proposed this to be used in the context of muscle hypertrophy. So this is what I mean. This is an entirely social media created issue where they've took this and they've just extrapolated it, all this information straight to a resistance training context and also potentially a muscle hypertrophy context, and it just doesn't sit in there at all. There's nowhere even remotely near the level of evidence needed to make that a reliable observation.
Yeah, and there's no even way. I don't even think there's a way to kind of measure the moment arm because the brain doesn't even know. How would the brain even know where the moment arm is if there's no physical way to
No,
tell?
it doesn't. That's a physical distance. The brain will interpret that through, so the larger moment arm you have, the more a muscle fiber has to shorten. Um, so the brain will likely sense that through Golgi tendon organs or muscle spindles, will give feedback on the total or the length change that the muscle's going through. So while it's not a physical distance, which a muscle or the brain, sorry, will not know, it's the impact of that physical condition on muscle fiber length that it will probably sense. But again, when you go through a large moment arm, you are shortening the muscle more than you would with a smaller muscle arm. In terms of producing that torque during the resistance exercise, the physics is actually doing more work for the muscle than it was at another time at a smaller moment arm. And of course, the muscle fiber velocity increases with a larger moment arm as well. So if you go back to the role of the force velocity relationship potentially in muscle hypertrophy and sense and tension and all that, and cross bridges form, you've actually accelerated the speed of which that muscle fiber is shortening by increasing the moment arm length as well.
Which reduces the force as well. I mean, if you have a
Which
fast,
would potentially have it has a negative impact on force producing capabilities. Yeah. So you get that trade-off between the velocity and torque. So when you go look at your smaller muscles, some of them are designed to contract fast. Some of them are contract to produce force largely. But as soon as you've got the increased fiber, shortened velocities, which you get with the larger moment arms, as you trade off force for that.
and at the end of the day, we want to produce force, and where we have the greatest moment arm doesn't always mean we have the best length tension relationship or we generate the most force. So ideally, following that length tension relationship, that ideal optimal length will be probably the best position to generate force. As a
Exactly.
great
And so
doesn't
this
always.
is where you need to separate out torque, which is muscle fiber force, and the moment arm length, which is what you observe as the external amount of torque that you produce, versus the actual muscle force. So torque and muscle force is absolutely not the same thing. So if you're getting physics to do the work for you all the time by having a nice long moment arm, you're allowing the muscle forces potentially to be lower. But that's just when muscles moment arms and the change in the moment arm length are kind of in opposition to each other, or they're not aligned. There are instances where the maximum moment arm aligns with the maximum muscle fiber force, which you're looking as well. So this is again comes to the application of this for resistance training, and why I don't think anybody I've seen at all has got certainly where I'm coming from in the design of lengthened partials and how this actually translates into exercise design. What you have then, when you know your moment arm lengths and you know your force length curves, or the approximate force length curve, should I say, if they match up together, those 2 points, like they do in the pecs, for example, the pectoral muscles, you have a region within your range of motion that your pecs can go through that's got a very steep bell-shaped curve, which means when the moment arm rises and your force rises at the same time, the torque generating capacity at that portion of the lift is massive compared to the either side of that range of motion. So when you go through a certain range of motion, I'm not going to give away all the secrets on the podcast straight away. When you go through a certain range of motion and you're either side of that massive steep bell sort of shaped torque output in the middle of the range of motion, if you pick a load that allows you to go through either this part of it or this side of it, you've well underloaded the central portion where your muscle can produce a phenomenal amount of torque because it's at its highest moment arm and highest fiber length. So you're essentially picking a load when you go through a large range of motion that is completely underloading where the muscle has its highest forces. So that is going to far from optimize the peak active forces that a muscle can produce.
And
Does that make sense?
that's just the tip of the iceberg, because this can be a huge conversation, but at the end of the day, there's just no evidence. No direct evidence, at least.
No, well, again, even if you're looking to entertain the principle of neuromechanical matching, there's a lot of methodological problems with it. EMG, which I'll not get into, but you would have to. EMG is probably not going to be able to resolve at a high enough degree of accuracy to prove neuromechanical matching in a lot of instances. And again, even when you drag that, again, sorry, just to go back to even the dragging that into resistance training for hypertrophy and resistance training in general, a lot of this is done in isometric contractions, not dynamic contractions, because EMG is so limited with dynamic contractions. Hardly any work ever gets done on anything dynamic, and that completely changes the complexity of activation patterns, moment arms, etc., as well. So that's just one part. The contraction type is dynamic versus isometric, and also now we're talking about different contraction types as well. Eccentric contractions don't go through the same recruitment order patterns as isometrics either. Anoka and Duchateau has shown firing rates are completely different and stuff like that. The triceps surae recruitment order, which the principal neuromechanical matching was done in, that order is completely different. So that's what I mean when I say there's a whole list of things that are not anywhere near shown that could mean a reliable transfer of that theory to resistance training.
Absolutely. And I think this podcast might spark a lot of controversy now. We might get a lot of questions in the comments. So if time allows, maybe if you're willing to, we can hop on another one, talk more specific about it. But as for today, I think I've already taken up enough of your time. So Dr. Gerard McMahon, thank you again for joining us. Do you know where people can find you, or if you're on social media, if they have questions, or go check out your videos of any sort?
Yeah, unfortunately, in terms of like TikTok and Instagram, I don't have a huge amount of content up there at the minute because I'm a full-time professional in university. I'm a lecturer in muscle physiology and biomechanics, funnily enough, and I also work with elite athletes. So my time is incredibly limited, but the very limited content that I do have, but I hopefully will have. I have a lot more kind of almost there ready to put up, related to virtually everything that we've talked about tonight. Um, Ready to go up. So hopefully that'll come up in the next few months. That's Muscle Mechanics Lab on both TikTok and Instagram, and also on Twitter. You can just find me at Gerard Mac, and that's just a lot of general sports science talk.
And I'll make sure to link them down in the section below. So again, thank you for watching, guys, and Dr. Gerard McMahon, thank you again for your time.